the sense that Anne develops of herself, independent of any determinate narrative of who she is, through her capacity for this kind of Wordsworthian self-recollection, comes out most in the moment where, again, the tables are turned in a way. Frederick is overhearing her, where she had overheard him deliver the hazelnut speech. Now he's overhearing her in conversation with Captain Harville about the relative constancy and fortitude of the love of men and women. And this theme of narratives, who gets to tell the story, comes up when Harville said, I could bring you 50 quotations in a moment on my side of the argument, and I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say on woman's inconstancy. Songs and proverbs all talk of woman's fickleness, but perhaps you will say these were all written by men. And this is one of my favorite lines in the whole novel, that the way she responds here. It sounds like the playful irony of Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice. And this is the moment of, Frederick falling back in love with her. While he's overhearing them, he's writing his love letter to her. You can hear the irony in what she's saying, which is jokey, but it has a crucial underlying point about who gets to tell the story. And there's a sense, an independent sense of Anne's self-determination. She's telling her own story that she's developed by this point. So, but perhaps you'll say these were all written by men. And she replies, yes, perhaps I shall. Yes, if you please. No reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher degree. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. So back to that romantic point, that life is in the moment. It's not to be captured or understood, fixed in a text. So she refers again to the idea of proof. She says, you can't rely on books. It's a difference of opinion between men and women that does not admit of proof. So it's interesting how she earlier used this word proof. It's like the proof of friendship that she found in Frederick's deferral to her judgment, his noticing of her fatigue and concern for her fatigue. Those were proofs of friendship, but they only have personal value or validity to her. They're part of her own story, the way in which she's choosing to remember her relationship with Frederick and think about Frederick. They're not about proving definitively one argument or another is correct. The deepest irony in Anne's statement, of course, is that the pen is in Jane Austen's hands. When she writes, the pen has been in men's hands. And I think we are supposed to bear in mind that it's not just men's books that don't prove anything, but also Jane Austen's book, also the book in our hands. And that applies to the idea of, the title again, persuasion. Language is something we do. We can't fix values, define values definitively, win arguments definitively. What books give us are allegories and metaphors that we can use to inform what counts for us moment to moment. But that question of proof and personal value is ongoing process and judgment that is never definitive. What she's saying here is precisely this. Each relationship is just full of accidents. The only proof we can get, or provable story, is the one we create for ourselves as we go along, navigating the uncertain circumstances of life. We each begin probably with a little bias towards our own sex, and upon that bias build every circumstance in favor of it which has occurred within our own circle, many of which circumstances, perhaps those very cases which strike us the most, may be precisely such as cannot be brought forward without betraying a confidence, or in some respect, saying what should not be said. So proof, what counts for oneself, is too idiosyncratic to count objectively. Captain Harville tells of such a story, the grief that a man feels as he says goodbye to his family. And Anne replies, I don't dispute that. I should deserve contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were only known by women. No, I believe you capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion, to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives and lives for you. So having an object, men need the narrative of their own purposefulness and the actuality of their love and accomplishment, their identity. Whereas, by contrast, Anne continues, all the privilege I can claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone. So that's one of Anne's key lines in the whole book, and it's a paraphrase of one of the concluding lines of Prometheus Unbound. Hoping till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. Frederick, overhearing these words of Anne's, is pierced in his own words. Her words give him a new idea of constancy than he had conceived before. Richer one that's about absurd faith. It's not about the actual narrative of actual life, but maintaining this hope. So this romantic idea of the power of the imagination is what pierces him, breaks through his hazelnut hard armor. So in other words, Austen does not reduce the love affair or, the story of restored love to a determinate narrative, a resolved narrative. She leaves it an open kind of bond on a more poetic plane, like just a shared dream. And I think that recalls how she narrates the restored love of Elizabeth and Darcy too. So listen to how she narrates Elizabeth's reaction to Darcy's second proposals. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of feelings which, improving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. Again, these terms, proof, value, but Austen does not spell it out. She leaves the narrative of Elizabeth's expression of love and a restoration of her love with Darcy in the same kind of lank, generic terms that we saw before in the summary of Anne's initial romance with Frederick. And then Austen even gives a kind of hypothetical. She tells us of how Elizabeth would react to Darcy's eye if she could see it. That dream image or negative image, an image of what is not seen, that's the place of proof of friendship, love, affection, the value of human compassion. In other words, the happy end of these love stories is like the happy end in The Eve of St. Agnes. It's left a dream. It's not determinately assured by the narrative. I mean, the narrative is assuring enough, but it's not spelled out. The happiness is not detailed in the narrative. It's left a place of imagination. So listen to how the moment of restored love and persuasion is narrated. Charles is walking with them and then says he's going to go back to town. There could not be an objection among Anne and Frederick. There could only be the most proper alacrity, obliging compliance for public view. Smiles rained in and spirits dancing in private rapture. So she's describing their joy as private. She's bracketing it off even from her own readers. It's bracketed. They are disguising it from the public around them. But Austen, analogously, is veiling it to her readers, maintaining again that kind of blank mask, de-individuated. It's private rapture, letting the reader imagine what they will instead of spelling it out. But she does spell out a kind of poetics of self-authorship, imagining oneself into the future, imagining how one will remember this moment in the future. Austen designates the parameters of Anne's memory, how she will organize her emotions and memory, how she'll recollect herself. So in half a minute, Charles was at the bottom of Union Street again, and the other two proceeding together. And soon words enough had passed between them to decide their direction toward the comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, where the power of conversation would make the present hour a blessing indeed, and prepare it for all the immortality which the happiest recollection of their own future lives could bestow. There they exchanged again those feelings and those promises which had once before seemed to secure everything, but which had been followed by so many, many years of division and estrangement. There they returned again into the past, more exquisitely happy perhaps in their reunion than when it had been first projected, more tender, more tried, more fixed in a knowledge of each other's character, truth and attachment, more equal to act, more justified in acting. And there, as they slowly paced the gradual ascent, heedless of any group around them, seeing neither sauntering politicians, bustling housekeepers, flirting girls, nor nursery maids and children, they could indulge in those retrospections and acknowledgments, and especially in those explanations of what had directly preceded the present moment, which are so poignant and so ceaseless in interest. All the little variations of the last week were gone through, and of yesterday and today there could scarcely be an end. It's like she's reborn, like a new time, a new kind of rhythm of time and experience. They've grown. They're more equal to act, more justified in acting. That's the narrator's free and direct discourse channeling Anne. So we're not told how they act exactly, but we're shown what it means to put dreams into action, what it means to be faithful to a dream is sketched out, much like in a Keats poem. The relationship between the fantasy and the living, breathing body is schematized, but not narrated, not reduced to a specific story. So I think we're left with the Cinderella story as a fantasy, like as a myth that we can inhabit and organize our lives. But Austen doesn't offer readers the illusion that it actually happened. She leaves that to the readers to imagine for themselves and live out, justify, become equal to in their own actions. The 20th century poet W.H. Auden wrote a long poem in the style of Byron, and he refers to Jane Austen in it. In this stanza, he also refers to James Joyce, whose books were outlawed, or Ulysses was outlawed as pornographic when it was first published. So he says, speaking to Byron, "You could not shock her more than she shocks me. Besides her, Joyce seems innocent as grass. It makes me most uncomfortable to see an English spinster of the middle class describe the amorous effects of brass, reveal so frankly and with such sobriety the economic basis of society." I think Jane Austen does reveal a lot of uncomfortable truths, but I've tried to show that I think she gives the reader exercise in something like what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to at least exercise autonomy over your desires and fantasies and memory, the way the narrative of Elizabeth Bennet's response to Darcy's second proposal hinges on the image of his face which she wasn't looking at. This kind of fantasy that's always a part of experience, a way in which our experience is always informed and framed by ideas, fantasies, imagination that go beyond what we can know. It'll allow us to shape our time the way Anne does in the analogous scene when Anne and Frederick are walking along the path, and the narrator says in Anne's voice something to the effect of how yesterday and today will never end. She's taken imaginative authorship over her time, her embodied experience in time. I've compared Anne at the beginning of Persuasion to the marginalized perspectives of women in the novel Frankenstein. But I think one of the most beautiful passages in Persuasion, it's in Anne's voice, but it's about her friend Mrs. Smith. And Miss Smith, if anything, represents a marginalization far more radical than Anne's. But in this great passage, Anne reflects on that marginalization. She could scarcely imagine a more cheerless situation in itself than Mrs. Smith's. She had been very fond of her husband. She had buried him. She had been used to influence. It was gone. She had no child to connect her with life and happiness again, no relations to assist in the arrangement of perplexed affairs, no health to make all the rest supportable. Her accommodations were limited to a noisy parlor and a dark bedroom behind, with no possibility of moving from one to the other without assistance, which there was only one servant in the house to afford, and she never quitted the house but to be conveyed into the warm bath. Yet, in spite of all this, Anne had reason to believe that she had moments only of languor and depression, to hours of occupation and enjoyment. How could it be? She watched, observed, reflected, and finally determined that this was not a case of fortitude or of resignation only. A submissive spirit might be patient, a strong understanding would supply resolution, but here was something more. Here was that elasticity of mind, that disposition to be comforted, that power of turning readily from evil to good, and of finding enjoyment which carried her out of herself, which was from nature alone. It was the choicest gift of heaven, and Anne viewed her friend as one of those instances in which, by a merciful appointment, it seems designed to counterbalance almost every other want. So, in this class, I've tried to suggest that this ability to get carried out beyond oneself, to use imagination and the sense of negative capability, to put alternative scenarios in play, to have your sense of purpose always in question and a source of exploration and curiosity and creativity, is a crucial aspect of the kind of world that we live in. And we're responsible for creating our own sense of purpose, and doing so is something that we do in time. It's about how we organize our time. And imagination is for application to our day to day, our actual time in the world. I talked a lot about value and proofs in this discussion of persuasion. It's interesting story, this 10-pound note with Jane Austen on the back has a quote from Pride and Prejudice. I declare, after all, there's no enjoyment like reading. What's funny about the quote, though, is that it's something that one of the Miss Bingleys say, who Austen really ridicules for, not being a reader. She's just saying it to try to impress Darcy or something, just trying to sound smart. So in a way, it's kind of perfect, that Austen it resists commodification. I think that's a kind of perfect irony. No one shows as much insight into what Auden called the economic basis of society. But on the other hand, no one demonstrates such wit in maintaining a sense of play. A basic idea that being able to read means being able to see the world otherwise, not have your experience entirely determined by judgments or evaluations outside yourself. Austen recognizes the reality of economic power, but she's just as much devoted to the importance Miss Smith articulates of grace, imaginative freedom. That's the same thing that Keats is celebrating on Chapman's Homer. It's not pretending to escape economy, the realms of gold, but just to keep open a peace beyond peace. There's a dream of peace that we always have to make the actual peace, the status quo, accountable to. There's a dream of love that we always have to keep actual life and experience accountable to. Dreams of justice and so on. And we have to measure our own lives against how we might imagine our lives. And that's what Jane Austen novels are for, giving us much smarter, better informed perspectives on domestic and intimate life, much better informed about especially the experience of women. Shame is a central theme in Jane Austen's novel, especially fear of shame, fear of losing class status, being snubbed. But Austen's novels also teach a kind of shame. That is, they teach a character like Frederick to be ashamed of a disregard of the consequences of his behavior that he had before. And that's a feature, I think, of romantic poetry in general. It's teaching us to be a better people, to be a better society, to be better family members and lovers and so on. I mean, what Austen's novels do is test our capacity for empathy, for social imagination, thinking ourselves into the complexity of all sorts of social networks. And that's an organic kind of learning. We become different people by imagining ourselves into these different kinds of networks. The concern that we learn is not easy to unlearn. And I think that's how a lot of social progress happens, is by learning to notice people, perspectives, and things that we hadn't noticed previously. And once we do notice it, we can't unnotice it. That's how women got the vote. It seems impossible on some level that a minority that has the vote would lessen the value of their privilege. But men were shamed into it once they recognized the reality of other social perspectives. It gets very hard to unrecognize it. Again, that's why I think social movements today around counting and noticing the experience of different kinds of racial and sexual minorities is so vital, and an ongoing legacy of romanticism